Hello and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramestow, and I'm very pleased to say my guest today is Sommer Hunte, who's the Outreach and Research Officer for the Institute of Gender and Development Studies. Welcome to the program, Sommer.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you just had a recent event, which I tried to get you on earlier, but I know you were very tied up with the event, which was the Public Forum on Women and Political Power, and was held in the middle of March. How did that go, and what was the purpose of that whole public forum?
Okay, well, it was called Women and Political Power, Right to Lead, and it came out of the whole discourse surrounding the performance of Prime Minister Persad-Bissessar and then Mrs. Penelope Beckles-Robinson, who's attempting to run for a position of leadership of the PNM party. And so we thought it was a timely event to really capture the issues and the dialogue around these women who are seeking to validate their political power and also to access political power. And it was very well received. We had a very good turnout. Mrs. Penelope Beckles-Robinson actually made a surprise visit and made some comments that kind of spurred on for about 2 or 3 days in the media. And we had very good question and answer. And it's actually on the IGDS page if anyone is interested in seeing it. So it was really well received, and we do hope to have more events like it.
It's interesting. I mean, many people don't really think about the gender aspect of politics and political power in general. Is it significant? I mean, we've seen obviously some strong women in power around the world. We haven't in the Caribbean for a very long time, but we've had a few fine instances of women in power. In terms of its impact, how significant is it?
It is very significant. You see it from our language and how we speak about women in politics. So one of the key issues that we raised was that you refer to as Kamla or Penny, and then when you move over, it's Dr. Rowley, right? Or Keith Rowley, or even Rowley, just the last name. So that same respect is not given, and therefore they're disempowered at the beginning of the conversation or the beginning of the media story, depending on who's relating it. And so it's very important. Gender is featured very importantly in political power, even how we perceive what power and leadership and who should have it, how it should be displayed, by whom. So if Mrs. Persad-Bissessar displays a gruff tone, it's seen as out of character and she's being aggressive. If Dr. Rowley displays a gruff tone, he might be chastised for it, but it's seen as part of his personality and his display of leadership.
Or he's seen as being firm or strong.
Right. So there is that kind of struggle that can be defined within the gender discourse that you find in leadership within political spheres.
And in some instances, it seems to me that the women themselves in political office sometimes buy into that as well. I mean, if you mentioned the fact that people refer to the Prime Minister as Kamla, but that was pushed as part of the whole campaign, which is to make her more personable and talking about being a mother and a grandmother and stuff like that. Is it possible to buy too much into sort of gender roles when you're selling yourself politically?
Well, definitely there is that struggle to find a balance, and it all depends on how we define leadership when we're going into the political space. So her attempt to get in and then she got in was to define herself as Auntie Kamla or the grandmother or the mother who understands the needs of her children after being under sort of patriarchal, strange, overly powerful fatherhood type of regime just before, and she's coming in as the mother who understands and can therefore uplift the people and that sort of thing. So she had to shape her campaign in that way. But then there's also the risk now that she's being perceived as too soft, or maybe motherhood is not what defines leadership, or what else? How do women then fall into patterns of leadership that are defined within masculinity? So there is that fine line that she has to kind of straddle. Sometimes she missteps, sometimes she kind of captures it. So during the campaign, she definitely captured it because she won. But now we're seeing different backlashes coming from that discourse where they're saying she's not strong enough, she's not firm enough. She has to do this as defined by her masculine peers, you know, in terms of what they see leaders as, but not what she probably perceives leadership to be.
I mean, she's an interesting case study in herself, isn't she? Because
Yes,
I recall before she took the reins of the UNC, there was that time when she was basically kicked to the curb by the sort of the power within the UNC. And she made that very famous speech, which I refer to as I Am Woman speech,
Yes.
where she stood up for herself on the platform and refused to sort of kowtow to her male colleagues. And then from that, she sort of basically conquered the party.
Right.
But yet, despite having done all that, you still hear people talking, and I'm sure there may be reasons for it or not, I don't know, about a cabal, for example. And that cabal is a male cabal, that she is being, she's a puppet for sort of male figures within the party, and therefore anything that she does is not herself doing it. I mean, is that sort of a degradation of her as a woman?
Yes, it is, but it also goes back to what I raised in terms of language and how we speak about our female leaders. So the power is given to her. It's not that she takes power, or it's not that she steps into power. It's the same way a man might. He might just get into office. She was given the office, right? So you see this kind of dynamic where she's being disempowered even while trying to assert herself as a powerful woman. And so you have to reaffirm her power by a cabal of men who, I guess, the wall
The power
behind
behind the
her.
throne,
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And she's the queen, so she has to be protected, right? So you even see this discourse, if you go back to Queen Elizabeth's in the past, they had the men behind them. So even though they were the queen and the head of the empire, the men were behind them and gave them that power. The men were the ones who went into war for them, that sort of thing. So you see that same kind of discourse coming up again in the Kamala Persad-Bissessar regime.
But you don't see the sort of Joan of Arc discourse, do you?
No, you don't.
But I find it interesting because, I mean, we mentioned the fact that she's so sort of personalized with the Kamala name, for example. But you never heard Mrs. Thatcher being referred to as Maggie, or
Right.
Golda Meir being referred to as Golda, for example, or Indira Gandhi having her first name used. They were respected as powerful figures in their own right, regardless of gender. Is there something about the Caribbean or about us in Trinidad and Tobago that we have a problem with it?
I wouldn't say it's regionalized, but I would say we have to look at the context within which they operated. Thatcher came in a post-war kind of setting where, well, even a Cold War setting where she had to be tough, she had to be firm, and she came in with a type of personality that was already masculinized. So she became the Iron Lady and the representative of what a woman should be in leadership, and sort of a departure from femininity completely. Golda Meir came in a time where there's a lot of struggle, a lot of tough things that she faced. I'm not sure that we can lay that context here because there isn't that type of impending violence that shaped the environment that Kamala Persad-Bissessar is operating in. So maybe there's a different type of situation that she's working with that doesn't require her to be as strong or as militant in her operations. So therefore she can step into that role as anti-Kamala and then go back into Madam Prime Minister who is able to fire someone for misconduct, or who is able to stand up and say, okay, we're not going to do this because it doesn't seem legitimate.
I mean, when it comes down to politics, I mean, in a really macro sense, is there even room for for traditional ideas of femininity or masculinity? Isn't it just about getting a job done? At that point, do gender roles really play that much into it, other than the fact that a person is a woman or a man?
Well, it has to. You come in with certain personality and character traits, and if you come in as a woman, it's often feminized. If you come in as a man, it's often masculinized. So it's inescapable. Certain traits will abide with that person. However, again, it goes back, how do we define leadership, right? Because what are we looking for from Mrs. Persad-Bissessar? If she's too soft or if she's too tough, there's always some complaint, some kind of backlash. Even when she makes a move to right or wrong, we see protests coming up now saying, no, she should not have fired her ministers and that sort of thing. But is it right to say that she is too feminine or too masculine in performing those duties? I don't think that is what the discourse should be. Is she performing as a leader? And in performing as a leader, is she falling into what we define as a leader? How do we define what a leader is in Trinidad and Tobago, right? So we've had past examples. The first leader, Dr. Eric Williams, father of the nation. What did he prescribe a leader to be? And is that something that has followed through to today? And is that where she's falling short in our image as a leader? Is it that we now need to revisit how we perceive a leader and redefine it and give clearer guidelines?
And do the times define what a leader should be?
Exactly, and I would argue that they do, the time and the space. So as we said, Margaret Thatcher had to be a certain type of leader. Golda Meir had to be a certain type of leader. Kamala Persad-Bissessar needs to be a certain type of leader. But then it's also our responsibility as citizens as well to let our leaders know what we want from them. It's not that they're supposed to define what we need. As a citizen, we're electing them into office. What are we electing them for? To provide for us certain services that we can't necessarily do ourselves, and that's why we have a governmental structure. So it's very important that we let them know what we need and what they need to do for us.
And I guess, given the fact that you're obviously in gender and development studies,
right.
you are aware, of course, the fact that there are so many complexities and layers to gender roles. And the Prime Minister, I don't want to be sort of stuck on the Prime Minister, but she's a good example because
yes.
she is a person in political power. She comes from an East Indian background in Trinidad and Tobago, and I guess there would be sort of different gender expectations based on race and ethnicity as well, wouldn't there?
Yes, and definitely when you go into the discourse of ethnicity, because it's more accurate to talk about ethnicity in the Trinidadian and Tobagoan context, you find certain cultural values, cultural norms applied differently across ethnicities, even if they're all women. So the problem when you talk about Mrs. Persad-Bissessar, and with reference to now Mrs. Penelope Beckles, where they say, no, we can't have another woman because Mrs. Persad-Bissessar had messed up so badly.
And therefore all women.
Exactly.
Right.
You can't paint all women along the same lines. They each come in with different characteristics, different values, and they operate differently across settings, right? So this is where it becomes very important. And how do we understand gender? How do we understand the intersectionality with ethnicity and cultural values, cultural norms within each ethnicity? And going forward, how does that then translate into what we want from all leaders?
Do you think the expectations would be different for a female political leader of African descent in Trinidad and Tobago than it would be for, let's say, Kamala Persad-Bissessar, who is of Indian descent?
It's quite possible that it would be, because
when we talk of strong Caribbean women, no matter what milieu we're in Trinidad and Tobago, I think the world sort of views it as a strong black woman.
Right.
I mean, for good or for bad, that's how the world views the Caribbean.
Yes.
And that's almost an expectation that Caribbean women are strong. But I think Indian women, based on sort of, I guess, background, are expected to be a little more, I'll use the word demure, even though that's really Victorian, but a little more demure in their sort of demeanor. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, it would be, because, well, if you look at a lot of the extensive research that the IGDS has done, stemming from Professor Reddock, Professor Patricia Muhammad, Dr. Gabriel Hussain, who've really unpacked the nuances of Indo-Caribbean feminism, you see that you can't paint a slate across all women in the Caribbean. Caribbean women are complex and have a multiplicity of different cultural backgrounds, cultural influences, and so it's fair to say that an Indo-Caribbean woman coming into power may be different from an Afro-Caribbean woman coming into power, but you can also say within the Indo-Caribbean society, depending on where they're from. So if they're from an urban setting, if they're from a rural setting. So it's very
and
fair to
religiosity
say
comes into play as well.
religion comes into play. So if they're from a devout Hindu background, if they're from a Catholic background, depending on where they're from, there are all these different influences that shape how they would act.
And how we would perceive those actions as a public.
Exactly, within positions of leadership. So it's very fair to say that. It paints it quite clearly.
I mean, I guess the thing is with anything, when we're looking at the performance of a political leader or a politician in general, whether they're leading or not, we are actually placing our own sort of prejudices, expectations, and backgrounds onto that person.
Exactly.
And how we judge them.
Yes.
So it's really not as much about them as it is about how we perceive them.
And which is why I'm saying, other than the perception, it's now our responsibility to see what we need from a leader, what we define a leader as, and also to understand what influences our perceptions. Because we can say, okay, a leader has to be strong, but what influences that perception of leadership? Is it that they need to be strong, or is it that they need to be firm and comprehensive in their actions across the board, so there's no preferential treatment for one and not for the other? How do we define this leadership, and what shapes what we think a leader should be, right? So again, going back to, we can't have another woman because we've had Persad-Bissessar and such has happened. What is painting that perception that all women would operate in the same way, right? And then if it's that you think anytime a woman goes into that institution, then maybe it's an institution that we really need to look at. Because if they're going in with certain values and they're practicing other values once they get in there, who's to say that it doesn't affect men in the same way? It's just that men have been there all along, so we perceive it as natural to men, but therefore it becomes unnatural to women once they get into that space. So then, therefore, we have to question the institution, question what values and characteristics the institution holds, that then sort of changes, often corrupts people once they get there.
I mean, the Caribbean, for whatever its flaws, we actually don't do too badly when it comes to women in politics, do we?
No, we don't. We're actually one of the #1 regions in the world. We have the most women in political leadership right now. So you have from Portia down to Kamala, and again,
at the top to the bottom, yeah.
Exactly.
Of the Caribbean.
Right. So you see, and even in local government, it's
We've
a
had
lot
Dominica,
of women.
of course.
Right,
Yeah.
Dominica. So you have a lot of women in local government. You have them in the Senate and so forth. So there is that influence. And then when we look at the party mobilization, truly it's women who've mobilized the party. The problem comes, okay, so if you look at the party structure, it's a separation of women in the party, even while they're the key mobilizers. So you have the women's caucus. You don't have a men's caucus. Why don't you have a men's caucus? Why do women have to be separated when they're operating with such strength within the party?
Well, it speaks to the patriarchy that is politics, doesn't it?
Exactly. So you have to really analyze, how do we move forward from this? Because if we're saying that we have progressed to a point where there's supposed to be gender equality, maybe some of these structures need to be revisited. Maybe it's not that there needs to be a women's caucus. Maybe it's that it needs to be phased out. Maybe there's supposed to be a new board where we look at specific issues, gendered issues, but women are phased into the normal stream of things within the party. Maybe we need to phase out having a lady vice chancellor. We don't have a gentleman vice chancellor. So we just have a vice chancellor or two, and you fill that position. If it's necessary, maybe you need to have a quota system so that we ensure that women are able to access this power. But we also have to really pay attention to how we define the power that's being given. How do we create the accessibility for it? Is it through money, through financial backing? Is it through popularity? Is it through some sort of nepotism, that kind of thing? We really have to pay attention. How do we get people into those spaces, or how people can get into those spaces? So it's not that they're being given anything, it's that they're taking the initiative to really find their way into those positions of power.
Even the fact that you mentioned the fact that there are women's caucuses, the example I mentioned with Persad-Bissessar, when she was told, okay, you're in charge now of the women's caucus,
Right.
which was, I guess, a form of like, know your place.
Yes.
Just having it there is a reminder of the fact that there is a place for women in politics, and not
Right.
necessarily at the head of the table.
Right.
But that's a way of thinking that's going to be very hard for politicians to get out of, isn't it?
It is.
Especially when it's
because
ridiculous given the fact that half the voting population is female.
Exactly. Well, more than half in some cases. So it's very important that you really address these issues. And it's time for women as well to, question, why are we holding on to certain things? Maybe we need to phase certain things out and really reshape them. Maybe the system has been in too long. So it becomes traditional and nothing really progresses from there. So what is the importance of the Women's Caucus now? How do we reevaluate ourselves and make sure that it's not that we're being given power, It's that we are naturally progressing into power in the same way that men have been able to over the course of centuries.
Now, to switch gears for a little bit, because I don't want us to run out of time without dealing with this, because we mentioned before we started the interview,
Yes.
the fact that we've had a spate recently of videos, and this of course relates to gender, of girls fighting,
Right.
thanks to the smartphones' ubiquity. So we're seeing this, and there's a sort of a level of horror about the fact that girls are fighting, which is somehow fundamentally different to the level of horror we have about boys being caught in the same situation fighting.
Exactly.
Where does that come from?
It comes from how we perceive certain characteristics and behaviors between boys and girls, men and women. So it becomes very unnatural when a woman displays violence. So for example, when you look at, say, Criminal Minds or any of those shows on TV and it's a woman who's a serial killer, there's shock and horror because she's one in 1,000 men, you know? So it's very unnatural for men to display violence. But the key here is that not to focus that, oh my God, it's girls fighting. It's what is happening that we're seeing more and more violence across boys and girls, across regions in Trinidad and Tobago. Because very recently, the young man who stabbed the other young man and killed him, the fight last year, I think it was, where someone got stabbed in the eye with a pencil. And it's a certain type of aggression being displayed rather than just a simple school fight where, you know, you tussle a little bit and then 10 minutes later you're talking and you're good again. There's a certain type of aggression being displayed where it's out to kill or out to maim.
But that's almost a manifestation of what's happening in our society in general, isn't
Right.
it?
But it's too simple to just say it's a manifestation in society, you know, or sort of a parallel to what's happening in adult society. It's actually a display of certain functions or certain institutions in society breaking down, right? So we have to identify what those institutions are. It's too simple to say they're mimicking adult behavior because that could mean anything. So we have to identify what structures...
No, but the adult behavior in itself is a result of institutions breaking down.
Right. So it's very simple to just say, you know, they're mimicking or to just punish them and it will solve it. You really have to identify the structures that are breaking down. How are we failing them? Because really the adults have to be accountable in the situation. How have we failed these young people to the point where the only way they can resolve things is through violence and not through words or not through any other form of resolution? Right? Because it's clearly the violence that we're seeing is a lack of ability to verbalize what is happening on the inside, right? What trauma they're experiencing on the inside that they cannot vocalize, and they have to use extreme forms of violence, I mean, almost to just maim or kill. So there's clearly some kind of structure that has broken down, that has failed these young people, that we have to identify and now try to recover and correct.
But of course, we as a society lack apparently the will or the intelligence to sort of approach it in that way, because our first reaction is usually to say, based on radio programs I listen to, or shows I watch, is either they need licks or they need Jesus, one or the other.
Right.
Never about, let's examine what's going on here
and that's
deal
the
with it.
unfortunate thing too. We really need to revisit our media. How do we then talk about these things so that it's not sensationalized, but the corrective path begins, right? So it's not that, oh my God, look at those girls, they need Jesus, they need to be threatened by a judge, they need to do jail. No,
Bring back corporal punishment.
They need, right. I mean, they're giving out licks. How is giving them licks going to resolve the problem of them giving out licks? It doesn't really equate in that way. So we really have to stop acting panicky. We really have to stop acting as an afterthought after things have happened. It's like we're in shock that this is happening. This has been happening for a long time. It's just that somebody had an iPhone, someone had some type of social media entity, and they put it online, and we all of a sudden, it's like our eyes are open. It's happening constantly. So it's really, how do we redress what has failed these young people so that they're unable to verbalize what they're feeling on the inside and have to resort to aggression.
And I guess there's also responsibility on the part of the media when we show videos like that, but in fact,
Yes.
it isn't necessarily always constructive, is it?
Exactly, and this harkens back to what happened, I think, was it last year or year before, where the young girl was molested, and it showed repeatedly. And how has the media matured from that point? Because it did go into court that, yes, this is wrong, it has violated some legal framework, and beyond it, it has violated a moral compass that we should be having. So how has the media matured from there then to really encountering these videos with a more
Without re-victimizing the victim.
Exactly. Yeah. Well thought out way of going without re-victimizing the victims, without sensationalizing young people who don't have the mature mental capacity to deal with this in the way that an adult should be. And we have to remember, these are young girls. They're pubescent or prepubescent. They're going through all sort of hormonal changes, which we fail to understand. They feel things, their sensory perceptors are very sharp at that age. So they feel things more than an adult might feel at that point. So if another girl looks at her wrong, she's immediately offended. She doesn't know how to tackle that. So is it that the girl hates me? And it could have been just that the girl looked at her or looked past her and she thought it was a bad look. You understand? So how do we talk to these young people, help them understand that there's certain ways to react
and ways not to.
ways not to.
We're completely out of time, Sommer. I don't know how to. This is the
Oh,
fastest
gosh.
half hour ever.
Yes.
But I hope you'll come back on the program. We can continue our discussion.
Yes, I
That'd be
do look
wonderful.
forward to that.
Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. You've been watching One on One. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.